Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I am, of course, your freshly showered host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Catherine West. Catherine, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. It's nice to see you.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an archaeologist at Boston University, so I'm in a department of anthropology, but I'm also in a specialized archaeology program. And I do my research in subarctic coastal Alaska. But I'm really interested in all of the themes of human environmental interaction across the Arctic and the subarctic. Um, did you want to know about my background, my education, and so on?
Absolutely.
All right. So I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm home again here with this job by random chance. And I went to college at Bryn Mawr, which is in Philadelphia, and it actually has one of the oldest anthropology programs in the country. And it was established by Frederica de Laguna, who was the first woman to do research in the Arctic. She was a cultural anthropologist, and she was the first, I think, in the 1920s to go to the Arctic with some of the big famous ethnographers and do ethnography there. So I was already aware of Arctic archaeology and anthropology when I was a little undergrad. And one of my professors was doing a project in the Aleutian Islands, and he sent out an email saying, would anybody like to go? And I said, oh my gosh, I think I'd really want to go. And so I applied and I got a little scholarship to go with him to Alaska for a month. And I was totally hooked after that. The adventure was pretty exciting. And so I decided to go to grad school. I went to the University of Washington, where there is an Arctic anthropologist, Ben Fitzhugh, and there's a zooarchaeologist, Don Grayson. And I worked with both of them to get where I am now. And I was really lucky after I finished my PhD to do a postdoc at the Smithsonian, which was another pretty thrilling adventure. And now here I am at Boston University.
Awesome. So, what we're going to be talking about today is some of the environmental challenges we face in the field of archaeology. So, living here in the Southeast, we get used to the 90-degree heat, the 30-degree winters, but it doesn't usually get colder than that. So, what I want to talk about today is what happens when it gets extremely cold. So, Catherine, how cold are we talking about when we talk about Arctic archaeology?
Well, I work primarily in the islands of the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, which form the border between the Bering Sea and the North Pacific Ocean. And it is actually there, it is surprisingly temperate. So in Boston here, we get down to zero, single digits every winter. This year we had no snow, but we often have a lot of snow. And in comparison, Gulf of Alaska on average is a bit colder more consistently. But we have relatively similar weather. The thing that's really different about the Gulf of Alaska and Aleutian Islands is that when they say they have a storm coming, it would be hurricane level here in the Northeast. And so, or down south where you are. So they're used to really high energy marine environments. But then as you move further north into the high Arctic, you're talking minus 50, minus 60 degrees on a regular Tuesday in the middle of the winter. So the gradient along Alaska is pretty extreme.
So, what kind of artifacts do you actually find in that kind of environment?
Well, it depends really on where you are. In the very high Arctic, where it's incredibly cold, it's also really dry. So things preserve amazingly well. There's a site on the Bering Sea called Nunallik, which is further north. It was excavated by Dr. Rick Knecht at University of Aberdeen. They found hair, they found dog fur, they found fingernails or dog nails. So preservation there is incredible. But we find what most people find, which is a really huge dominance of stone tools for all kinds of different activities. They might look a little different in the coastal environment than you're used to in Alabama or I'm used to in central New England. They're very coastally oriented. So people are fishing, they're hunting for marine mammals, they're using kayaks. I always like to describe the ocean as a highway there rather than something to be afraid of. So their artifacts are very oriented toward the sea. So we have knives called ulus, U-L-U, which are basically fish filleting knives. They're very common across the entire Arctic, especially on the coast. We have, in at least the Gulf of Alaska, beautiful long hunting lances made out of slate, which, depending on their length, they could be used for whaling or sealing. And my favorite thing about them is that they're usually etched with lines. We're not entirely sure what those lines mean, but they seem to be a mark of the owner of the lance. So the person who actually harpooned the whale, when the whale floats up to shore, you could pull out the lance and see who made that kill, and they can claim ownership of the hunt. So they're very coastally oriented fishing and hunting artifacts. There's also a range of beautiful artwork, although we don't find that preserved so often because it's generally made out of wood and bone. But there are some remarkable wet sites where we can find basketry. Masks are very common in the coast of Alaska, all around Alaska and the Arctic, and other ritual objects that are a little less clear.
So I imagine that the sub-freezing temperatures do wonders for preservation. Like you can actually find things like hair and fingernails that here in the southeast would gradually degrade over time because of the ambient temperatures and humidity.
Yes, absolutely. Those frozen, especially further north where there's permafrost, and it's like a nice freezer where you can put things underground and they stay intact. And you might have seen recently, especially in Norway, and some of the passes in Alaska, and maybe down into Switzerland and the Alps, there's this new trend in ice patch archaeology where sadly glaciers and ice patches are starting to melt, and they're revealing sort of ancient passages through the mountains where people dropped things. So in Norway, they're finding spears and shoes that are thousands of years old, where people were making their passage over the mountains. And we find those also, those have been recovered in Alaska where the ice and snow are retreating, and people obviously had passed before us. The
So
other thing
what?
that preserves
Oh,
oh, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing that preserves really well is ancient DNA. So I collaborate with an ancient DNA specialist at the University of Oklahoma, and every time I send her samples, she tells me how wonderful the preservation is, and the nice cold environment has really supported not just artifact preservation, but then molecular preservation also.
So, what do you like most about working in the Arctic environments,
What do I
other than
like
the beautiful
most?
landscapes that we all know as Alaska?
Well, I was going to say that the number one thing probably is just being there. The landscapes, again, they're really variable. If you've been far north in Alaska, it's actually in many places really flat, very windswept. As you move further south, it can be sort of like Southeast Alaska is very supports a rainforest. And where I work in the islands of the Gulf of Alaska, there are no trees there except for Kodiak, which has the biggest grizzly bear in the world. The Aleutian Islands don't support big mammals, so it's sort of grassy, beautiful, windswept, very ocean-oriented environment. So I think my favorite thing is being there in that spectacular, very exciting, almost sometimes dangerous feeling place. And then my other favorite thing is all the people that I've met working there. The academics that I've met and I collaborate with, and then the people who live there are just welcoming and wonderful. And it's a pretty great place to work.
I imagine it's a fairly isolated place to work, though.
Yes, it is. I had an interview with someone else the other day who asked me about strategies for preserving eroding archaeological sites in the coast of these islands. And I said, it's just not possible. Nobody lives in these places. You can't go out and monitor the state of sites. So yes, it's a very isolated place. Most travel to sites is by boat or by float plane. So a plane that can land in the water, like on a pond or on the ocean, because there are no roads, there's no infrastructure, there's no houses to stay in. You have to camp when you do field work in most places. So yes, it's incredibly isolated.
And I think this goes without saying, it gets very cold too.
It gets cold. I mean, most people, of course, do their field work in the summer, especially the higher north, further north you go. And field seasons are surprisingly long because you have this just massive investment in getting to a place. So you might have to helicopter there. You might have to hire a very expensive boat to get there. So people tend to spend months in the field. doing work. But down in the Gulf of Alaska, yeah, we've started when, at the end of May, when it's still freezing at night, there's still ice in the ground when you're trying to dig a site. But by the time the height of the summer comes, it might get up to the 60s during the day and be beautiful and sunny because, of course, the sun is up, or you're exposed to the sun in the summer for like 20 hours a day. So it's very bright. Although in the Gulf of Alaska, it rains something like 2 meters a year. So there's a huge amount of rainfall. It's very wet.
Now, forgive me if I'm wrong about this, but there are times of the year, and especially in Alaska, where it's night for an entire month.
It's dark. And poor Alaska has the disadvantage of being really far west relative to the rest of the US, and yet we sort of rein them in on a time zone. So it is dark when they go to work, it's dark when they're at work, it's dark when they get home from work. So obviously field work really is not happening at either the height of winter because of the conditions or because of the dark. But then the flip side is the summer is really light.
So when we think of summer here, it's usually the first or second week of May and then goes to the end of probably August or September. Is it the same in Alaska or is it completely different?
No, the summer season is far shorter. I actually just looked at Kodiak, Alaska yesterday, and it was snowing heavily. So summer won't start, at least further south, until at least June, late June. So you start to see summer resources like halibut, big fish like cod coming back closer to shore, migratory birds starting to come, leave and go further north. And then, of course, the further north you go, the shorter and shorter the summer grows. And by your definition of summer, you probably never even get there. Although the center of Alaska around Fairbanks can get up to the 90s, and they've been having some pretty severe heat waves in the last 5, 6 years.
Yeah, severe heat waves is how we define summer here in Alabama. I would kill for like a 60-degree summer. Then that way I could, get a nice even tan, but also not get sunburned.
Well, you're balancing that with really heavy cloud cover and pouring rain. So you're probably not going to get much of a tan. I don't think most Alaskans have a tan.
Yeah, I was thinking probably the worst skin condition you could get is probably like chapped lips from whiplash or
Frostbite.
windburn. Yeah, frostbite.
Frostbite. Mhm.
So that brings me to my next question. What are some of the challenges of working in such a cold and isolated environment?
I think well, for me, the weather is probably not the greatest challenge. I like cloudy weather. I don't mind being cold and having to deal with the cold. But in terms of that weather, you have to have the right gear because in combination with the isolation, if you don't have the right gear, you could die. It is extreme. You can get hypothermia in the middle of the summer. You can get ill and there's nobody available. The Coast Guard can maybe come and find you, but you're so isolated. So the combination of extreme isolation in most of these places and the severity of the weather, if you don't have the right preparation, can be very challenging. So I have worked on a little tiny place called Chirikoff Island, which is it's kind of in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska. It's 60 miles by air from any other landmass. And you have to hire a plane to go there. And it is incredibly windy. So we needed mountaineering level gear to prevent our tents from flying away. And you need some precautions to stay safe in that very wet, cold place, so that you're not putting yourself in danger or your students in danger. So I would say that combination of isolation and the demands of the weather are the most challenging thing. Is that what you asked me? What was the most challenging?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you actually take students with you when you
Ew.
go on these trips. What do you tell them to get them ready for what's getting ready to happen to them?
Well, yeah, I actually learned from one of my mentors in grad school who had an application process for his field school, which included very honest questions about how prepared you were to live in this kind of environment and hike in this kind of environment. So again, we don't have a car. If you want to walk from your camp, which will be near a freshwater source, to your archaeological site, wherever that might be, it might be a couple miles. You have to be able to carry your shovel, your trowel, your food, your clothes, everything on your back. You have to be able to hike and lift and do all the things that you need to survive in that environment and flourish and enjoy yourself. So I'm pretty honest with students about the demands of the physical environment, and we talk about first aid. Most of us have had kind of wilderness first aid training, what to do if you're out in the middle of nowhere and something bad happens. The University of Washington offered a course done by an Alaska bush pilot to teach us how to deal with problems out in the middle of nowhere. So I'm pretty honest with the students, and I do have kind of a questionnaire that they have to fill out about whether they feel physically ready to go into the field in that way. So it can be difficult for people who require some accommodation to get out to those kinds of locations.
And I imagine there's, an adjustment period from day one to, the end of the first week, just getting, set up, acclimatized to I guess, letting the isolation just sink in.
Yeah, you can't call home. Cell phones don't work. You can't get mail easily. Can't take a shower at the end of the day. You have to figure out how to, bathe, and there's an outhouse, and it's rustic is a word. It's remote. So there is quite an adjustment period, but every student I've worked with has adjusted really well. And if you have a good guide and a good mentor to take you there and help you anticipate what you need and help you get the correct gear, I think it can be a huge success.
Okay, so on to the most important question. How do you handle the food situation? I mean,
Oh, the
we,
food.
we all know what archaeological projects and programs run on, and it's caffeine and snacks.
Well, we definitely have caffeine and snacks. I can say that. It depends on the project I've been on, but in most recent years, I've been working with the Alutiiq Museum, which is a tribal museum in Kodiak, Alaska, and they have three awesome archaeologists who work there and have long field careers. And they bring a lot of comforts into the field because you need them. There's a lot of canned spam because it travels well. But my experience with them is that if you like to fish, then you can supplement with fish really easily. We bring vegetables that will survive for a long time, so carrots and cabbage and that kind of stuff, so you do get some vitamin C along the way. Lots of caffeine, lots of packaged snacks. But of course, to get to any of these places, if you're taking a float plane, you have to think about how much weight you can bring with you. So you can't bring, archaeologists love to bring beer in the field, but that's so heavy, there's no way we could fly that in. We've also arranged for
That's the real tragedy of these.
it weighs too much. So you can also arrange, if you have a big enough budget, for a food drop. Say you're in the field for a month and a half, you can get a food drop halfway through from the float plane. That's a big grocery bill and a big delivery fee, but it's worth it if you can budget for that kind of thing.
But that means they actually fly over your site and drop the food for you.
No, they usually land. They usually land.
Okay.
They like to come in for a visit. In my experience, the pilots love to come in for a visit, have a cup of coffee, see the site, walk around. A lot of them never get out at these places where they get to fly over, and so they usually really want to stop and come in and see what we're doing.
Yeah, when you said food or supply drop, I was picturing like a military style,
Actual
like
drop.
fly over and the people like on the ground cheering and shouting because relief was finally.
It does feel like that when the plane finally comes over. There's cheering for sure.
Well, I mean, yeah, because the snacks are there.
They're there, yeah, and some human contact after such a long time.
So when you go out, how many people do you usually take on a team with you? Because I imagine having to care for, so many people makes it harder in such an isolated environment. You can't just get your team in the trucks and leave at the end of the day.
Oh, no, I mean, I've been to some really remote locations with teams of very different sizes. And I would say, from my personal experience, the sort of easiest to arrange and most successful team size was more like 5 people. But I have been on teams of 20, 25 people out in those remote locations. And that is a far more difficult logistical nightmare because you need a boat to move that many people. A float plane only seats so many. You need obviously a lot more snacks and caffeine to keep those people fueled. Health varies among those people. If one person gets sick, everybody gets sick. So the larger teams are a lot more difficult. I've had better or not better, but easier logistical experiences with smaller teams of like 5 people.
So I've heard this. I don't know if it's actually true or not. During the day, does it help you stay warm to actually keep moving, like
Oh,
continuous
sure.
movement?
And I don't, yes, totally. If you're sitting there in the rain and it's 40 degrees and blowing, you get cold instantly. I mean, that's one of the good things about, say, a survey or doing test pits across a landscape because you're constantly moving. If you're doing an excavation and you're just there with your trowel, you get cold really fast, especially since you have to wear rain gear over everything. So you've got this giant rain gear with layers underneath, rubber boots and so on. So I actually like survey and test pitting because you're on the move. We also tend to eat really fatty food to keep ourselves warm, hence the canned spam.
Oh, I was gonna say, just wait for a nice chunky seal to come, just like popping through the side. I'm like, well, dinner came to us. Here we go. Well, I mean, that's how a lot of, or that's at least what I imagine a lot of like Arctic diets look like is fatty fish and chunky mammals.
Yeah, the coastal diet, at least, before Russian colonization and American colonization, the coastal diet in Alaska was heavily dominated by fish, salmon, all across the Gulf of Alaska, Pacific cod. Salmon are a nice fatty fish. Seals, sea lions, whale. But there was also a lot of plant food. There were a lot of birds as part of the diet. So they had a pretty good balance of fat and carbohydrates, but fat is a huge deal in a place where it's cold. And it also helps you store your food. So berries were often stored in seal oil to keep them preserved for the winter. They would bury farther north, they bury walrus in the permafrost so that it will ferment. So fermented marine mammal fat is a popular food. And all of those things are ways to keep your population alive when the winter is so harsh that you can't go fishing or hunting.
Do you have a lot of problems with the wildlife there? I imagine since it's so isolated, you really don't have a lot of wildlife interaction. Like here in the
There's a
southeast,
lot of wildlife interaction. So it's so isolated that the animals are not prepared to see you there. So on Kodiak, particularly on the southwest side, it's the largest population of grizzly bears in the world. So they're physically the largest ones, the Kodiak brown bear, but they're also the densest population of grizzly bears. So they are everywhere. And so if you're surveying in May, when the salmon are starting to run, and bears like rivers, salmon like rivers, people like rivers. So the archaeological sites are really concentrated along the rivers. You and the bears are going to interact. It's inevitable. So you really need to have bear awareness and understand how to have a safe camp where there are bears, and also to move through the landscape in a way that's really safe when there's bears, especially mamas and cubs early in the spring. But out in the Aleutian Islands, there's a lot less animal interaction. There's no bears out there. There are a few little foxes, which are pretty pesky, but otherwise it's pretty, we don't have the snakes and so on that you have down south.
yeah, I'm actually just tempted to just come up to Alaska just to avoid the snakes and the insects and the sunburn. Just pack up and go. I don't care where I'm going.
I would not
So
like that.
yeah, so I'm assuming you've had more than one bear encounter. How do you prepare for that?
Mentally, I'm not sure how to prepare. I am really scared of them. I find them terrifying. Other people are not as terrifying. They call it being paranoid. So, being worried every turn. The thing about Kodiak is that there are no trees, but there's no large trees, but there are shrubby trees, and the bears like to sleep in the shrubby trees. The grass is as tall as I am, so over 5 feet tall. So it's very easy to come upon one when you're not really expecting it. So I've had training in firearms use. I would never use a gun against a bear because you have to be a really excellent shot to cope with a bear, and they become enraged if you're not. We have flares that we carry to scare them off. And bear spray. I always carry bear spray with me, but I've never had a dangerous encounter with a bear. I've always had pretty, we've seen each other, the bear has run off, and I have moved away safely. So I've never had a bad encounter with a bear, thankfully.
So that's just about going to do us for today. Catherine, what kind of advice would you give to people to prepare for working in an Arctic environment other than what we've gone over so far?
If I were talking to students, I would tell them to find lots of people who can give them advice, who can take them on projects. It's so expensive, it's so isolated that if you can find a mentor who can take you with them the first time, the first two times, that will be your best path to success if you want to work up in the Arctic or the subarctic.
So, how would they go about finding someone who specializes in really something like this? Because I know there aren't that many people who just randomly take trips up to Alaska.
There are not, but there is an Alaska Anthropological Association, and most of us who do archaeology in Alaska, for example, and many people who work in Canada belong to that association. There's also the Canadian Anthropological or Archaeological Association, and most of them are working up in the Arctic. So that's a great place to find people. Go to one of those conferences. There's also a bunch of universities that have Arctic archaeologists. Boston University has one. Dartmouth has an Arctic program. Bowdoin College does. University of Washington, University of Alaska Fairbanks. So there's lots of professors out there to find that students could connect with in those three different ways.
Well, Catherine, that is just going to do it for today. Thank you again for joining me. I've really enjoyed having you on the show.
You're welcome. It's nice to meet you.
You too. All right, that is going to do it for Archaeology After Dark today, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and stay tuned for the next one.